Hello, I'm Janice Sabin. I'm Research Associate Professor at the University of Washington, Department of Biomedical Informatics and Medical Education, adjunct faculty in the School of Social Work, and affiliated with the University of Washington School of Medicine Center for Health Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. The interview you're about to see is my interview of Dr. Anthony Greenwald, Professor of Psychology at the University of Washington. And we're here to discuss appropriate use of the implicit association test for educational purposes. Dr. Greenwald received a BA from Yale and his PhD from Harvard. His recent research has been on implicit and unconscious cognition, especially applied to the phenomenon of stereotyping and prejudice, and to mental processing of subliminal stimuli. He's received the Distinguished Science Award from the Society of Experimental Social Psychology, the Lifetime Achievement Award, the William James Fellow from the Association for Psychological Science, and is an elected Fellow of the American Academy of the Arts and Sciences. His 1995 invention, the implicit association test, enabled observation of unconscious attitudes, including one's own, and has revised understanding of stereotyping and prejudice. Dr. Greenwald has been at the forefront of the implicit revolution. In this video, he talks about the implicit revolution and how our understanding of implicit bias has become part of the national dialogue.
The implicit revolution is something that has been developing in psychology for about 30 years, preceded by a number of developments in the 1970s and early 80s. It's when cognitive psychologists started investigating what they put the label implicit memory to. And it was the idea that memories could affect people even though they could no longer remember the occasions or the events on which they acquired the memories. The implicit revolution actually amounts to what I now regard as a paradigm shift in understanding the way the mind works. The conscious mind produces judgments and perceptions which intuitively we think we are just perceiving the world accurately and validly. We know that that's too simple a picture, and we know that in fact past learning can result in distortions in memory, in distortions in perception. They're called visual illusions. Now we are discovering social illusions. For example, the illusion that male musicians are virtuosos and females are not, or that males are better leaders than women are, or better scientists and mathematicians than women are. These are actually social illusions that are very easy to perceive and very difficult to shed once you understand that they're not rooted in valid knowledge. Understanding this is important because once we understand that our conscious judgments are influenced in ways that we may not desire, then we have to start thinking about, okay, what do we do to control that and to get rid of those unwanted influences?
Dr. Greenwald, inventor of the IAT, describes the science behind the IAT and what it actually measures.
Okay, the IAT, that's the abbreviation for the implicit association test. We discovered that when people have to assign items, words, pictures from two different categories to the same response, and in the IAT we have subjects pressing a computer keyboard key for two categories and another key for a different two categories, that they do this much faster if the two categories are associated. The very first IAT used the categories of pleasant and unpleasant, and insects and flowers. And what we discovered was that if you have to give the same response to insects and unpleasant words, you can go pretty fast. Flowers and pleasant words, you go pretty fast. But if we switch the task so that flowers and unpleasant words have to get the same response, the brain slows down. It can't do that task as rapidly. And we get a time difference that gives us an idea of the strengths of associations among categories. And not much longer after doing that first IAT, this was in 1994 or 5 with flowers and insects, we replaced the flowers and insects with pictures of white people and black people. And we discovered that I was the first to discover this. It was a bit shocking at first. It was also pretty exciting because I actually didn't believe such a thing like this would happen. But I was slowed down when I was trying to give the same response to the black faces and the pleasant words, and I could just go as fast as you please if it was white faces and pleasant words. So this is how I discovered that I had something in my head that I wasn't aware was there. And we refer to that as an association, sometimes call it an implicit attitude, but it's an association of a racial group with a valence, meaning something positive or negative.
The IAT is very popular for use in classrooms, diversity trainings, anti-racist trainings, to increase one's self-awareness of their own bias. Tony addresses whether or not increasing one's personal bias has an impact on changing bias behavior.
We're jumping ahead a little beyond where I think we're ready to go. What I didn't say when I described the IAT when used with measuring racial attitudes and associations is that what it measures is not properly called racism or prejudice or bias. It is a racial preference. It means, in my case, that I associate more positivity with white than black. Doesn't mean necessarily that I dislike black or that I love white. It just means that there's a difference. And that's what the IAT picks up. And it's a mistake to treat that as racism. There's no component of hostility or prejudice that's actually contained in the IAT measure itself. I actually think that that kind of education is a good starting point for thinking about the challenge, the problem of what you want to do if you discover that you have this implicit preference or racial preference, or if you have a gender stereotype or an ethnic stereotype. What you want to do is to know that you have it, to know that it may be influencing your conscious judgments. That's part of this implicit revolution. These things can seep into consciousness without your awareness. And then you have to figure out what you want to do, what you might possibly do to avoid that influence. And that's not always an easy question to answer, but there is a very simple illustration of a way of doing this that works very well. And in the case of the social illusion of the male virtuoso, when symphony orchestras in the United States started auditioning instrumentalists behind a screen so that the audition committee could not see whether they were interviewing or auditioning a male or female, immediately the proportion of women being hired by symphony orchestras jumped. It about doubled from about 20% before this in the 1970s to 40% by sometime in the 1980s or 1990. And all they were doing was removing the possibility of knowledge of the gender of the auditionee, removing the possibility of that influencing judgment just by seeing that it couldn't even enter the mind. Now that's a model of a way to do something. It's not always that simple. And so the question sometimes becomes quite challenging to figure out what one has to do to prevent these cues that we do encounter all the time in work, in school, in any public setting, what we can do to remove those cues from influencing us in unwanted ways.
An implicit bias you found is really common, correct?
It's remarkably pervasive. This was one of the most surprising initial findings. It wasn't just that I surprised myself by showing that I have this racial preference. I can predict that about 80% of white Americans who try this will also discover that. fewer African Americans have it, but a surprising number of African Americans also have a racial white preference, which presumably comes from their living in a culture that has such a long tradition of higher white status and higher white privilege.
Mm-hmm. Often the IAT is assigned as homework before a class or a workshop. However, some research shows that this approach can have negative consequences, such as producing defensiveness and interracial anxiety. I asked Tony his professional opinion on appropriate use of the IAT for educational purposes.
Well, this is a great question, and I'm glad you're using the word education, because people are tempted to use the word training when they talk about learning about the IAT. And there's nothing about learning about the IAT that by itself is going to modify your judgment or behavior. You can be alerted, however, to the fact that you've got something inside your head that you may want to watch out for and control. You mentioned mandatory use of the IAT. I and my scientific collaborators and most of the people I know think that mandatory required use of any kind of educational procedure is probably not as good as voluntary use. So people ought to be invited to try the IAT, but not required to use it. And I would urge a special caution with use of the race IAT, which is the most socially sensitive one we have, because if one doesn't understand the scientific basis for how the test works and what's been found using it, I can understand people drawing the wrong conclusions. I was tempted, in fact, initially when I first got my own result, I thought, okay, well, this is something I can overcome pretty easily. I'll just practice it a little while and it'll go away. And no. And I've taken the race IAT actually now hundreds of times, and I still show an automatic white preference. I don't know others who have overcome this by repeated taking it or even scientifically investigating it as I do. It is something that is laid deeply into our brains by the time we've reached probably middle childhood, if not even younger.
In this segment, Dr. Greenwald discusses what can be done to reduce or eliminate the impact of implicit bias on individual and organizational behavior.
This is a question with no simple answer. I know you've done research related to this, and you well know that every situation in which you might encounter a bias has its own characteristics, and those need to be taken into account. So the first advice is that don't expect easy solutions, expect to do some work to find solutions, but then there's also an organizational administrative problem. We're usually talking about people being in businesses, being in universities, being in public institutions, hospitals, for example, and it's necessary to adopt procedures that are widely used that can be tested and shown to be effective in controlling implicit biases. And in order for large institutions, organizations to adopt that, it's important that the people at the top of the organization think that this is the right thing to do. You know, if I'm visiting a university, I say, can I speak to the president or the provost, please, about these things? Because I think these are the people who need to be on board first and strongest and create the resources that are needed actually to do things that will make sure that the organization is operating in an equitable fashion. And it is not easy to do. Collecting data is usually a big part of this, because if you don't collect data to document whether what's called disparate outcomes are occurring to different groups, you don't first know that you have a problem, and if you have a problem, you don't know where it is, because it's not likely uniformly distributed through your organization. There are likely hotspots where it's worse than others. And data collection is definitely needed to document disparities and figure out where these need to be attended to.
The implicit association test is available to the public at Project Implicit, housed at Harvard University at implicit.harvard.edu. Tony describes the role of Project Implicit as an educational and research organization.
First, you give me credit for being founder, but I'm actually co-founder. Two colleagues, Mahzreen Banaji and Brian Nozick, were in on Project Implicit from the beginning. Well, since 1998, which was before the nonprofit, we had the website. And the website has been used as an educational resource. The nonprofit is a research resource. It actually conducts research on the internet using not only the implicit association test, but various other research measures created by other investigators, so that we can help to do research at all sorts of institutions. And we've been, our Project Implicit's clients include many researchers at universities, people who are in psychology departments like I am, but also organizations that are trying to do larger scale things. And this is really the most important function of Project Implicit, that research and the education that is done. We do education, we don't call it training. We make sure that when we offer education to groups, we see to it that they understand that we're only telling them about a problem and the possibility of doing something, and that will take effort on their part to deal with.
And finally, Tony summarizes what he would like people to know about implicit bias.
I wish there was one simple takeaway that I could say in about 10 or 15 seconds that would describe the panacea that will cure all. I do think that education is important. I think that's one takeaway. I think humility is important. One has to understand that one may be capable of doing things that are unwelcome, and that it is not easy to find the ways of getting rid of that. We actually don't understand what it takes to get rid of implicit bias well enough yet, so research on this is something that is part of what Project Implicit is trying to support.
Well, I want to thank you so much for this time and your time and expertise. Really appreciate it. The story of the IAT's development and significance appears in the book Blind Spot: Hidden Biases of Good People, Delacorte Press 2013, co-authored with Mahzreen Banaji. Funding for this presentation was provided by the University of Washington School of Medicine Center for Health Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, as well as the University of Washington Race and Equity Initiative.